All right, you guys, I am super excited. We have double trouble today. No, we have two guests. We usually don't get two guests. It happens rarely. But we have two guests for you guys. We have Eli Shannon and Amanda Regnier with us today. They're both working in the research world with sodium bicarb, and specifically, they just came out with a study looking at the Maurten product, and we're going to dive all into all of that today. But first, thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, and they're tuning in from London or outside, just outside of London, Liverpool.
I wish.
Outside of Liverpool.
Okay,
We're about, what, 3 hours in the train from London?
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to pick your guys' brain on some like travel spots. I gotta get over there one of these days. Okay, as our listeners know, we do our two truths and a lie. So I'm gonna let Eli, why don't you start first and break down your two truths and a lie?
So two truths and a lie in a randomized order.
Yes.
I've all studies. I'm fluent in French.
Okay.
I went to boarding school.
Mm-hmm.
What was my other one? I've been in the UK for over 5 years.
Okay. Great. All right. And then I'm gonna let Amanda, you break yours down.
I lived in Spain for a year and I never learned Spanish.
Okay.
I have no musical talent
Okay.
and I do not like coffee.
Oh. Oh no, you're gonna hurt my heart if that one's true. Okay. I'm gonna start with Eli's. I want to say the French thing just because of the comment you made to her about speaking French before the episode, that you are not fluent in French. Maybe you are fluent in French. Maybe that's why you said that. I'm gonna stick with my gut on that one for Eli. Don't tell me the answer. Amanda, I don't want to believe you dislike coffee. So I'm going to say that's the lie. I'm going to say it's a lie, but don't tell me the answer. We will reveal it to our listeners at the end of the episode to see who lived where, who speaks French, who or not, and all that good stuff. So we'll try and kind of be a little bit brief here because I definitely want to focus on the study, but why don't you guys each share with us a little bit about what drove you into the research on sodium bicarb at the end of the day. And Amanda, why don't you start?
Sure. So I was working as an endurance coach before this, so primarily in runners and a little bit in cycling and triathlon. And I really just wanted to really dive into deeper physiology type stuff and get a better understanding. And yes, I can read the literature by myself, but it's a whole nother story when you have people pushing you, you have deadlines, you have people giving you feedback, you're in a group that you can discuss different ideas. So I felt like it'd be a great place to really elevate my exercise physiology knowledge. And this project happened to be advertising for females, exercise physiology, and sodium bicarbonate was kind of the pitch that was proposed, along with the menstrual cycle as well. So kind of all of those together into one project. And it was a fully funded PhD project, so I applied and I got it. So that's kind of what led me into the bicarb side, kind of starting with the physiology, but with the project I thought was really interesting. So that's why I came over.
That's awesome. So did you say are you looking at the differences, like sex differences in sodium bicarb as well?
Not so much the sex differences. So I am writing a little bit about the sex differences, but mostly there's just not a lot of sodium bicarb done with females at all. And there's a lot more done in males. So all of my research is with females. And then with that, I'm not really sure how sodium bicarb could be affected by the menstrual cycle and phases of the menstrual cycle. So I kind of did a little rabbit hole into there as well, and how sodium bicarb could be affected by phases of the menstrual cycle, looking at maybe how estrogen could impact that. So that's kind of what my first study is looking at, is those hormonal differences with that sodium bicarb and the time to peak. So that will hopefully be submitted to publishing soon, but I have seen some differences in hormonal phases with the sodium bicarb. Not so much with the performance yet, but I haven't finished data analysis. But there is something going on with the metabolism of the bicarb that is affected by the hormones. So
That is so cool. We definitely want to have you back to go over that. So when it's all out, we want you back. That sounds very fascinating. And then
Absolutely. Yeah.
yes, and then Eli, tell us a little bit about what got you into this area of research.
Yeah, so I'm not sure what the States is like, but I did like an MRes in the UK.
Mm,
So basically it's like a master's of research. I'd done my bachelor's and basically I found, so I guess it's like your thesis advisor, is that sort of like the similar sort of, word, I guess. Basically I came to play football as well, so I came from like a football, like a soccer background.
hmm
Basically came, stayed here. And basically, by the end of my undergrad bachelor's, like I was kind of like, well, out of all the modules, out of all the classes that we're taking, like research, like I didn't have like a specific interest in one sort of thing. It was just sort of like the research aspect. Like every module would have like a dissertation, sort of, if you like, or a research project where you have to like, and that's kind of what like drove me into like research. So I was able to find like someone that wanted to take me on as basically as an MRes student. Did a project, became pretty invested in it. It was, I'm not sure if you're familiar with like blood flow restriction, ischemic
mm
preconditioning. So it was on that, and I looked at it in football players. So it was basically using my teammates as participants, really. And basically, yeah, it was similar to Amanda, like saw that Edge Hill had a post, full-time PhD student, fully funded,
Wow.
GTA as well, so you get to teach, and get experience in teaching. It was the same project that we both applied for in females, so sort of the interesting kind of like thing there is that like we applied for the same one, got females, female physiology. That was kind of like what we were both going for. But I turned up in October and told by the supervisors, no, you'll do something else. We'll do something. Amanda will take care of the female research, and yeah, I would say like, my passion for research lies on the mechanistic measures to explain the performance enhancing effect or lack thereof.
hmm
Because I think that's all really interesting, and that's kind of like what brought me here, really, I would say.
Yeah, awesome. The blood flow restriction stuff, just like really briefly. So one of my good friends, he's a PT and I see him all the time. He's like has those like cuffs and he's like got them on his quads or and he's
Yeah.
doing all that. What's going on? Just like briefly, like do they work?
So basically, yeah, it's the tightening of the blood. It's basically enhancing vasodilation, so the lengthening of the
Mm.
femoral artery. So
Hmm.
sort of thing, the one mechanistic measure that I took, this is, yeah, just to like not get too like into it. Obviously, we're here,
Yeah,
but the idea
right.
is it lengthens the artery, increases vasodilation,
Huh.
and the idea is that there was stuff that I had seen that was done on aerobic performance, so longer
Mm.
intensity, but I looked at it in repeated sprint performance just
Mm.
because that was sort of like more applicable to football, to soccer players.
hmm
And I did a repeated protocol, so 6 IPC blood flow restriction sessions in a 2-week period. And from there, it was kind of just like, everyone can do it like prior to sort of like competing or prior to
Mm.
a game. But I was just more so looking at like if there was a specific sort of like dosing strategy, if you like, to see if we do this X amount of times,
Yeah.
sufficient to improve. So I found performance enhancing effects with a low sample size, as you'd see usually over like a master's, but yeah, so that was, yeah, it does. I've seen studies that have shown that work, but there's also been studies that have shown that it doesn't work. I think
Yeah.
it's just like figuring out what that ideal mechanistic measure is. And yeah, so that's what I would say.
Neat. Very interesting. I have not heard of, at least yet, and endurance athletes utilizing that as a
Who doesn't
tool.
know?
Yeah, so that would be
Right.
interesting. Okay, so we will dive into our sodium bicarb conversation. So, I'm sure many of our listeners have heard of sodium bicarb. If they have not heard of sodium bicarb, I'm sure they've heard of Maurten as a fueling product, which has sodium bicarb hydrogel product that you mix together and consume prior to an effort. But before we kind of dive into all that, because you guys did utilize that product in your study and compared it, but can you tell us just a little bit about like what sodium bicarb is, why it would be beneficial for performance, what it's doing in the body, why it's working from a performance lens potentially?
Yeah, so I'll kind of take the beginning here. With the sodium bicarb, we're really looking at high intensity exercise. So when you're working out, kind of a little bit of the physiology background, when you're working out at really high intensity, we're getting that buildup of hydrogen ions and lactate. When we're working out at lower intensity, we're not getting that buildup. So the higher we work out, the more that acidosis is building up. And when you can take the bicarb, you can start to absorb some of those hydrogen ions. So typically with the acidosis, I wouldn't say it's the lactic acid necessarily it's building up, but it's really that hydrogen that's causing that change in pH. And then that's what's inhibiting our muscles from contracting as fast or as powerful. So when we can change that pH and bring it back up, so when the hydrogen is increasing, the pH is dropping, then we're having trouble contracting our muscles. But with that bicarb, we can get rid of that hydrogen to make a more favorable environment for our muscles to contract. So that's where really it's the high intensity work that we want, that's going to make the most impact and improve performance, be able to work at a higher intensity for longer. And I think that's where it can be a little bit confusing when we're not sure, like, oh, should we be taking it? Like, when's it best? How does it work? When we're looking at distances, I think that's also really important to keep in mind, because an hour, we can't really say it's great for an hour, it's great for 10 minutes. It's great for however long you can maintain a really high intensity exercise and then have that acidosis production. So if you look at an elite athlete, they can maintain, say, threshold or higher for more than an hour because they're really well trained. So that bicarb is probably going to work really well for them for longer distances. Whereas someone who's not as well trained, you can't maintain a high power for long. Maybe your threshold, you can last for like 10 minutes. Maybe you don't have a type of pain threshold. That bicarb isn't going to work an hour for you because you can only work really hard for a shorter period of time. So that's kind of the main mechanism behind the bicarb.
Interesting. Okay, so on that whole note right there, talking about it being effective for these like top end efforts. So in reality, it could be beneficial if someone's pushing that top end for a long duration of time versus like, it makes me think of creatine where it's like the first like 10-second effort sprint. Is it, if someone is 2 hours into a bike race and the bike race is it going to take about 2 hours and they're sprinting to that finish, are they going to get a benefit potentially?
I would say so, specifically on that. There's actually a study of people in Belgium. Basically, I think they had a long, like it was sort of like a long duration time trial or a long duration cycling event. And at the end of the protocol, the exercise protocol, they did like a 90-second sprint at the end. And this was following a loading sort of procedure of bicarb. I'm not sure how many, I can't remember exactly how many grams per kilo it exceeded. But they found that because obviously, like, you know, you've probably seen it, like in endurance exercise, there isn't a ton of literature on bicarb. And it's been overlooked quite a bit for various reasons. But that study showed a significant improvement in the power production at the end of the time trial, whether it was the 3-hour protocol, a 90-second improvement. So to get back to your question, a 2-hour bike ride, it would definitely, and that was in solution. So it definitely would be considered as something that would be performance improving towards the end of those latter stages of those races that utilize those non-oxidative energy sources.
But I think on top of that as well, the current marathon record holder, the male Kiptum, he was using the Maurten bicarb when he broke the world marathon. 2:35 he won, or broke the record. So it's tough because usually the bicarb isn't utilized for the longer distances, but like the study Eli was saying, that 90 seconds at the end worked great. But then we also know marathon athletes, there's talk that potentially some of the marathon athletes were using them in the Olympics with the Maurten bicarb. A lot of the track and field athletes were obviously using them, but they are longer. The research just hasn't caught up to what the athletes are actually doing in practice. But again, we can assume these high-level athletes can maintain that power for a really long time. So it's likely giving an effect, but we haven't done the research to show that, okay, they came in the lab, they ran a marathon, this was their time, they came in the lab, ran another marathon, you know, like it's not that research yet, and it's quite hard to get.
Yeah, like just to go on to Amanda's point, like it's insanely difficult to do sort of like those longer duration, like in a lab, in a face, like obviously it's tough everywhere to do it, but like in a laboratory where you're getting people in, like we were talking about how boring it is just to, you know,
5K.
5K,
like I'm doing a 5K study right now.
40K, you know.
Oh, boring. And like performance, not just physiological, it's psychological too. And so when you're trying to control everything and not give any like external stimuli, you can't say the same thing the same way, you can't have music, you're staring at a wall. I'm like, okay, now go as hard as you can. Like you can't really go as hard as you can in that situation. So it's really tough to measure.
So that's why I think we can probably, you know, like realize that the reason that there's a lack of literature with bicarb and potentially longer duration, high intensity efforts is due to, you know, getting the right people in, and getting them recruited, doing a statistically powered study with, you know, your familiarization, your placebo, your bicarb, your experimentals, you know, just to do that sort of right, all within a window where, you know, training intensity isn't sort of changing. Those are the main factors really, and I think you know, it's, you know, it's not that, you know, it's not that it doesn't work for prolonged high intensity endurance exercise. I think it's just the fact that it's very hard to, I think we're realizing it now, or you know, it's very difficult to, you know, recruit for studies like these. I think shed some light on the actual, you know, the study designs and stuff like that.
And I mean, a professional competing at the Olympic level is going to finish a marathon a lot faster and hopefully still have that bicarb potentially in their system versus maybe someone who's taking 6 hours to run a marathon too.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that was something we were talking about. Like, you know, usually in certain studies, like, you know how the margins are so thin, right? Like you have your margins, like your performance error and stuff like that. Like, you know, usually when you get like the more experienced athletes, you know, the well-trained athletes, there's going to be probably, you know, you'd expect smaller error, like smaller performance improvements from whether it would be placebo versus your experimental. Whereas when you have like your recreational athletes, like people that you're saying like 6 hours to finish a marathon or whatever, you get those sort of athletes that you're getting in, you know, you would expect to see potentially maybe a greater, you know, the recreationally active athletes are actually improving more. Whereas we probably think that's a bit different with bicarb because, you know, for it to be effective, the harder you have to be, you know, going at the hardest sort of like effort as you're doing it, where recreational athletes may not be able to sustain that sort of effort in a 40-kilometer time trial or a 5-kilometer run trial. So it's really about getting the right people in if you want to get the results that sort of kind of like show what, you know, this mechanism to support the mechanism really.
People have to know how to put themselves in like the pain cave, as some of the athletes call it.
They need to know how to work hard.
And pace. I found like in the 5K, like some of the athletes have been coming in who weren't as well trained, they really struggle with their pacing. So if they start too slow or too fast, that's going to really affect the whole trial. Because now they're not able to work as hard as possible. So now we're not sure like, oh, would the bicarb have worked if you were working hard for the whole 5K as opposed to going a little bit too easy and then like a little bit too hard. I mean, I haven't ran the splits yet, but it's really difficult, I think, to run high intensity for a long time.
Usually with the sort of like the, you know, probably get into it later in the podcast, but like sort of like the pacing strategy with the 40Ks that, you know, you start off really quick. Usually like that's what I've seen cyclists tend to do. I'm not sure if it's the same like the 5Ks maybe for the first kilometer or if it's different, but with the 40Ks, like they tend to start off really quick. You see their bicarb drop down, but then all of a sudden, you know, they kind of like go into a pacing strategy where they kind of like recirculate a bit, and all of a sudden the bicarb elevates. But yeah, it's interesting with like pacing strategies and the different sort of exercise activities and criteria of participants. So
Oh God, so fascinating. Okay, so you guys
Yeah.
came out with a study just recently. It came out in July 28th, right? And the effects of sodium bicarb mini tablets ingested in a carbohydrate hydrogel system on 40K cycling time trial performance and metabolism in trained male cyclists.
Yeah.
Let's dive into it. I'm excited. So tell us a little bit about your study design, maybe sample size,
Yeah.
and what you guys were looking at there.
Yeah. So, obviously, it goes back to sort of like I wasn't expecting to do sort of male athletes, still
Mm,
thinking about female athletes. So kind of like, the idea was kind of like, okay, like, what other avenues can we go on, right? Like there's been a lot of research, like we've seen like the 4 kilometer sprints, like we were talking about earlier. There's a lot of stuff with different sort of, capsules, gelatin, enteric, delayed release.
mm,
Obviously we had been given a product of the Maurten,
mhm,
and really it just seemed like an opportunity to kind of dive into maybe more prolonged high intensity. Obviously we talked about the article with the 90-second sprint at the end. So
mhm,
those sort of things. And yeah, basically it just came to like, how, about an hour effort, 40 kilometer time trial has a decent retest reliability, good validity. So that was sort of like the reason, as opposed to like picking like a prolonged high intensity task. In terms of like time trials in the UK, the 25-mile time trial equates to about 40 kilometers.
mm,
So getting participants in to complete a 40 kilometer time trial, they're familiar with it.
mm.
So that was kind of like, in terms of like the exercise task, that was sort of like the reasoning behind it. It's just participants would be familiar that cycle with a 40 kilometer time trial. In addition to that, so had 14 participants, that was a sample size. Include 5 visits, so a VO2 max test, which used just a standardized sort of like participant criterion, which
Mhm,
gave me a trained sample size.
mhm.
Obviously, you will have seen in some of the other literature, I'm sure listeners as well have seen like the time to peak alkalosis. So everyone has different views on this.
Yeah.
And basically, you know, first visit, participants come in, you weigh them. The dose that sort of is like common within the literature in the field is kind of like 0.2 to 0.3 grams per kilo. So that's the dosing strategy in terms of the mini tablets. So basically, you just give about, so for a 70 kg athlete, it would go to 21 grams. I'm not sure what that is in terms of like the imperial system.
We'll stick with
But
grams. We use grams
we'll
anyway. Yeah.
okay. So yeah, so basically, yeah, and then the Maurten system, the Maurten Bicarb system is composed of the mini tablets, so
Mhm,
0.3 grams per kilo of the mini tablets, and then 200 ml of water and 40 grams of carbohydrate
mm,
powder, which makes up your sort of like your visc mix.
mhm,
Combine the mini tablets inside the bowl. Basically, participants on the first visit, they ingest it, they ingest all the supplement, and then basically after that, we're just taking blood sample every 10 minutes to track the blood alkalosis, so track the blood bicarbonate concentration and the blood pH,
mm,
seeing where that maximal sort of like, where do we hit that peak? So
mhm,
obviously in some studies you'd see that in order to get an ergogenic response from taking bicarb, you kind of want a 5 to 6 millimole per liter increase. And that was been shown to do this time to peak strategy. It's been shown to sort of increase the ergogenic effects of taking sodium bicarbonate. There was a study by Bogman et al. It was actually in Canada, and basically they're looking at world-class rowers.
mm,
Rowing is another sport that take bicarb simply because of the position that they're in.
mhm,
There's not as much movement with the stomach, so less GI.
mhm,
And basically they were able to compare taking bicarb at time to peak, which is what we did, compared to a standard ingestion strategy of either 60 minutes, 90 minutes. And they found that taking blood bicarbonate or taking the sodium bicarbonate at time to peak increased the ergogenic effects in comparison to a standardized dose. So that kind of shifted the bicarb world a little bit in terms of like timing, because previously to that, you know, taking it at standardized suggestion strategies was kind of like sort of the norm. Everyone is more practical, but the fact that, you know, time to peak kind of opened that door of seeing, you know, potentially are there more ergogenic timings, that kind of led us to believe, okay, well, we should probably be doing that with this Maurten supplement simply because of the lack of research that's out there with Maurten bicarb. So following that, so time to peak was around probably anywhere from 60 minutes to over 2 hours in terms of like where it peaked at. And we're all well above a 5 to 6 millimole per liter increase. I think when you looked at the average of like the peak alkalosis response, it would have been anywhere from 90 to 100 minutes. But some people peaked at 60, some people peaked over 2 hours. So after that visit, a VO2 max test to determine participant criterion, followed by 3 40-kilometer time trials. The first one was a familiarization, so basically a 40-kilometer time trial. And after that, 2 experimental trials, whether it was a bicarb or a placebo time trial. And throughout all of these time trials, taking measures such as, so basically, throughout the duration of exercise, at every 10-kilometer quartile, so each quartile of the exercise, taking like a small 95 microliter sample, a blood sample, and that gives you your electrolytes, so potassium, calcium, chloride, and sodium, and your blood bicarbonate, your blood pH. So basically, we're just looking at the metabolism through exercise. So how does it differ from taking a placebo, basically, and seeing like what that blood bicarbonate bioavailability is throughout exercise, and are there any inferences that we can make based on sort of these metabolism measures that we're taking. In addition to that, obviously lactate as well. And for the first 3 sort of like time points, also took breath by breath analysis. So looking at the respiratory responses throughout exercise. So yeah, to sum up, found a 1.42% improvement. I believe 12 out of 14 participants improved performance, and we had a 5.6 millimole per liter increase pre-exercise. So along with the work from Amelia Carr from Australia, a lot of her work was sort of like a meta-analysis saying that, okay, you need like a 5 to 6 millimole per liter increase. So that was kind of like basically mimicking, so it kind of just made sense. You know, that was kind of like a sufficient threshold to enhance performance. However, there's been multiple studies prior where you can get an ergogenic response, but not have as much of a bicarb rise. So sort of like that 5 to 6 millimole liter range, it may not be as a big deal when taking sodium bicarbonate. In addition to the performance improvement, an interesting finding was that heart rate, VO2, perception of effort did not change. So that kind of suggests that, you know, less cardiovascular strain, but you're able to put more effort in and improve performance in comparison to a placebo. That was in addition to sort of decreases in particular ions such as potassium, chloride, increases in sodium, increases in blood lactate, kind of indicating that there was an improved strong ion difference, which sort of kind of suggests that there may have been improved contractility or improved muscle excitability as well. So there's obviously a lot happening. I think that's one of the nice things about doing prolonged high intensity exercise is that you're able to take a lot of measures. And yeah, there's going to be something. And it was really interesting with these findings. The respiratory responses were unexpected, but I think it opens the door for a lot of other research, whether that's to undertake economy protocols. But yeah, it was definitely a lot of analysis and a lot of hard work in the lab, a lot of long days. But yeah, we got through it in the end, and yeah, so it's you know, hopefully opens the door for other research as well from other laboratories and such.
So was this a crossover study?
Yeah, so it was placebo, yeah, double-blinded,
Awesome.
familiarization, placebo, bicarb control, randomized order.
Great. And so that's what for our listeners, that's like what we're looking for from a gold standard perspective from a study in most cases, right? So,
Yeah,
um,
I mean, I would say, there were I'm not gonna say what's wrong with the research that we did, the limitations or anything like that. Like, I'll let the listeners do that, but with every study, you're gonna have some limitations,
totally.
and it's just about like realizing them and
Hmm.
I think it's just being able to defend everything that you can do.
Hmm.
So a lot of the stuff that we've seen through social media, not to point it out or anything, but like they're saying, you don't have a traditional bicarb control trial. So you're
Mm.
not comparing the bicarb, the Maurten bicarb to like saying like a delayed release or an enteric
I
coated
see.
capsule or solution or
Mm.
anything like that. But the idea is that it's extremely hard to add additional trials and to particularly like ensure that there's just a lot of different factors, right? You would have
Hmm.
to, their blood bicarbonate response might be different than the Maurten one if they're taking different capsules or if they're
Hmm.
taking bicarbonate solution.
Hmm.
So yeah, obviously there's limitations, and I think it just opens the door for a lot of other studies to be done from other
Hmm.
groups.
Yes.
But
And
yeah.
so was the non-Martin group, were they still also getting 40 grams of carbs but just not with the bicarb in it?
You mean the placebo
Yeah, the placebo
trial?
group. Yeah.
Yeah, it was carbohydrate match. So they got the hydrogel,
Okay.
got the water, the hydrogel, and it was texture match. So we just had these non-caloric sort of like sweeteners
Hmm.
that replaced the bicarbonate sort of mini tablets. And I guess I should, the one main thing that, I kind of like missed out was the lack of, GI, the
Mm-hmm.
gastrointestinal distress
Right.
that but in the study, you would have seen that the listeners and everyone would have seen that there was no differences in GI, so gastrointestinal distress
Hmm.
symptoms between both conditions.
Mm.
Um, Obviously, there was some, and obviously, by Maurten, everyone says, they aim to eliminate any potential gastrointestinal distress.
Mm.
Um, but since there was no significant differences with the bicarb trial, with the mini tablets, the idea is that, the GI distress either came from A, the precision on the time trial on the ergometer from completing the cycling time trial,
Hmm.
or B, the novelty of the actual hydrogel. It's a new product. It's pretty awkward to kind of take. Like it's
Hmm.
not just your normal like energy gel or having a, sort of that. So or the combination of both of those.
Yeah.
So potential for, yes, symptoms were there, but in between both trials, there was no GI distress, any differences. And that's
Hmm.
quite something considering that, in the bicarb trial, obviously it's sodium, but the placebo, it's a low sodium. There was nowhere near the amount of sodium in the placebo trial in comparison to the bicarb one.
Hmm.
So the fact that, the bicarb condition didn't increase the GI,
Hmm.
an excess amount of sodium in comparison to placebo says something, I would say.
Yeah. And in the 40K time trial, are they using any other fuel or liquid during in
Just
any other groups?
water,
Just water. Okay.
just
How long was
water.
that
Yeah.
taking them out of curiosity?
The 40Ks.
Hmm.
I think the bicarb condition was around 3,798 seconds. And then the placebo was 55
3,000 seconds.
average. I know, I'm just thinking about when I put it into SPSS, like to do the stats and everything.
Do I have to
So
turn
for me
that
to
into
like convert
minutes?
that to like minutes, but I think it was just over an hour,
3,000 seconds.
just over an hour on
That's 50,
average.
3,000 seconds is 50 minutes. Does that
So
sound
it
right?
was 3,798, I believe it was. That was the
3,790. So we're looking at 63.3 minutes. Does that sound
Yeah,
right?
so an hour and three and a bit. So that
Okay.
was the sort of yeah, and like, there haven't been, like we said before, like on 40 kilometer time trial performance, like some of the studies that you have seen that haven't looked at like Bicarb with 40-kilometer time trial performance is that some of them you would have seen like time to be longer with some of them because the type of athletes that they're bringing in are potentially recreationally active. They don't normally cycle. They may have a high VO2 max, but they're not used to doing 40-kilometer on the bike. So yeah, that was yeah, the 103 sort of like, I think that was like a good enough sort of like participant criterion to get people in and cycle as quick as they could.
Yeah. And so you said the bicarb group improved performance by 1.42%. Is that what you said?
Yeah, so that equated to I believe it's a 54.14 second improvement.
54 seconds is a good chunk of time.
And in addition to 12 out of the 14 participants improving performance.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. That's a good chunk of time if you think about it. And then I want to jump back to the time to peak that you kept talking about, the time to peak of the sodium bicarb. Break this down for me. Were you testing, when you keep saying time to peak, you're testing when the time to peak was in each individual participant and then timing their dosing according to that? Or what was that like?
I think Amanda's the expert on time to peak. So
Okay.
I'll turn that over to her because we did the same protocol and everything.
So my first study that I'm working on right now is a time to peak study in females, 2 phases of the menstrual cycle. So with that time to peak protocol, you take the supplement, we do a resting blood sample, and then we do a blood sample every 10 minutes until they get to, so yeah, rested. So just sitting, not moving. They can drink some water during the protocol, but no caffeine, no food. So they're just sitting, they eat the bicarb, and then we take a blood sample every 10 minutes. For my protocol, I did it up until I got to a peak, and then at least 2 to 3 samples were either the same or a slight drop, or 180 minutes. So if I got to 3 hours, that's quite a lot of blood samples for one sitting in the lab. But if I got to 180 minutes, I at least got 2 samples that were the same with their bicarb, or I would end the test early if I saw that drop earlier. So when I started the exercise, so I also did an exercise trial, but with females, and I did 4 instead of 40 kilometers. They would come to the lab, take the supplement, and then whatever time it took them to reach their individual peak, we would start their warm up at that time.
Oh, interesting.
So that's kind of where it's a little bit different, that when we have access to a lab and when athletes have access to a lab, we can have them come, we can do this time to peak test, and then we can see exactly when you specifically should take the bicarb, because that's when you're going to have your maximum buffering capacity. However, that's not really realistic for most athletes to come and do a 3-hour test in the lab. It's extremely expensive. Never mind, it's not really that fun to have a blood sample every 10 minutes. Like, it's your fingers, I have little pokes my fingers for quite a while after that test. But that's where the Maurten, I think, is really coming in, because we can do these time to peaks, like Eli can do the time to peak, and we can see where generally people are peaking with the Maurten bicarb compared to an enteric, compared to just a solution. And I do that same thing with females to see where females getting that peak. But that's kind of only half of it. So we can see that peak, we can do the bicarb, but then with the Maurten, we're seeing a little bit of a difference in how it's absorbing. So we see that rise, and then we kind of see that level off. Whereas with other products like the enteric, we see it rise, we see it drop off a little bit sooner. So that challenges the idea that maybe, do we really need an exact peak if we're going to be rising, and then that bicarb is going to be staying for so long? So then if that's the case, then that's kind of where research is going in the future. And I think that's really a key of the Maurten product, is what's that graph looking like? Like, if you took it at 90 minutes or 2 hours, how different is your bicarb going to be? Are your bicarb levels going to be the same? So with our initial studies, we both did a time to peak to see where exactly you should take it. And then we did exercise based on that individual time to peak, but there is also general strategies that I think would be more beneficial for the Maurten. Like, people don't have to be so worried about exactly when they need to take it. But we're trying to, right now, I think it's 90 to 180 minutes is
Yeah.
what's recommended.
Yeah, or 90 to 2 hours on males.
Males, and then I think in general though it's like 90 to 180 based on
Yeah.
like the last slit review.
I think that, it goes along with one of the questions, in terms of like its bioavailability. Well, from doing a lot of time to peak tests, with male participants and female participants, yeah, they reach somewhere like a peak. However, it seems to stay elevated. What you have seen, like the 40K study that we just came out with, you have seen that the sort of like it still remains elevated in comparison to sort of like a placebo. So I think like that's really important. So obviously, like like Amanda said, the practical applications, the ecological validity of actually like, okay, like that's all great. We can get the blood bicarb responses, the blood pH responses, and determine like, okay, just because this may increase the ergogenic effects in comparison to a standardized ingestion point, how practical is that really? So along with like manufacturers sort of like recommendations for ingesting bicarb and everything, like the idea is really just like to sort of like ensure that it remains elevated. But the reason that sort of like time to peak exists is due to sort of like the likes of solution bicarb in liquid form, and the difference of variability in gelatin capsules and enteric coated capsules and delayed release capsules, because we don't know what the blood bicarbonate bioavailability is during exercise, or potentially at rest as well. What you'll see, like Amanda said, like you see that sort of like peak. Okay, that's all great. We'll start exercise there, but then after it'll drop quite significantly in exercise, and it won't have the ability to sort of like recover. That's probably the pretty interesting part about like the Maurten bicarb, is that the idea is that it remains elevated. You're able to use it, sustain it for long periods of time, where that would not be feasible. That would not be applicable to sort of like your liquid form of bicarb. No matter what dose you're with, they'll just metabolize the quickest out of those. But
Yeah. Interesting. So with your studies looking at that time to peak and then starting them in their time trial at that time to peak, in reality, when you're taking those blood tests, you see it climbing. You're looking for that peak. So if someone were to take it, consume the product or consume bicarb, say, and then start racing 30 minutes later, it's likely still peaking, and then they're reaching that peak at some point into their race after they're like well warmed up and have started. Are they noticing like some minor benefits as it's starting to build up, or are they really only getting those benefits when it's sustaining at that peak, and that's when they should really be going like full gas?
I think it really depends like what sport you're going to be training for. So if you're going to be doing something that's really short, high intensity, you really want to wait the full time to get the most amount of bicarb in your blood, so it's there waiting for you. So then when you start your high intensity exercise, you have that acidosis build up, and the bicarb is there to bring it back down. If you're doing something a little bit longer, say the marathon, say we're running a marathon in 2 hours.
breaking the 2 hours.
Breaking the 2 hours, but we know that it's been used in the marathon for around that 2:03 or whatever it is. Just over 2.
2 hours 35 seconds.
I think in those cases, because you're not going to get such a huge response in that acidosis right away, you probably could. It doesn't really matter if you wait for the bicarb to get to its peak. You probably could take it at the beginning of your race, and there'd be more of a slow release. Because there's a few ways that the bicarb works as well. Like one is, yes, we're going to buffer that acidosis. One, in the future, we do want to look at, and needs to be looked at as more as that economy. So to see if you take the bicarb, is that actually allowing you to be using less oxygen at a given pace? We know with the bicarb also, we're getting an increase in lactate as well. So we get the increase, the hydrogen's coming out of the cell as well as the lactate. And then with that extra lactate, potentially that can be turned back into pyruvate to give birth as energy. And maybe we're getting an additional energy source slightly from there as well. And then also with the bicarb, are we also maybe getting some reduced perceived perception of pain, less RPE scores? So for those longer events, I think that's where we can see some of the other aspects of bicarb working, not just the high the high buffering and the high hydrogen that we need to buffer. But in the short events, I think that's where you really want to wait the full time and have as much bicarb there as possible to get ready for that high
That
intensity
makes
event.
sense.
I
So
think just to, sorry, keep
yeah,
going.
I was just gonna ask, do you know, can people go into a lab and get these incremental blood tests? Like, can people pay from the public to get that done?
Not in our lab.
Not in
but-
our lab, but honestly, if you're gonna take the Maurten, which is probably the way you'd want to go, like you could get it from the store, mix it with the powder. But we don't see the sustained increase with the powder because it absorbs in your stomach. We see that rise up and
Oh.
rise back down again.
Yeah.
We see a big increase in your blood bicarb, but it goes back down. And then with it being absorbed in the stomach, that's where we're getting a lot more of the GI issues and the stomach cramping, nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, that kind of stuff. Whereas with the bicarb, if you're going to take the bicarb, we've seen less GI. Obviously, you want to test that first. Don't like go to your race and first day you're going to use the bicarb. But because we see that it rises and then stays for so long, I don't honestly think it would be a good use of your time or money to go to a lab and know exactly when your peak is, because I don't really think it's that beneficial given how long that window is that it's going to stay elevated for.
Okay, cool. What were you going to say, Eli?
Oh, I was just gonna add, kind of like the way that you were mentioning about like, you know, taking it sort of like, you know, you start like your race is like 30 minutes after or whatever. I think one sort of like methodological thing that we kind of adopted that I think is pretty good in the sense that, you know, we would, you know, so on an exercise trial, you'd have the participants come in, potentially take a baseline, you know, resting blood sample, ingest whether it's bicarb, placebo, blinded, and following their peak, you take a pre-exercise, so a pre-exercise blood sample that sort of gives you like your increase of bicarb and pH. After that, they've reached their peak basically, and then the participants start their warm up. They get on the bike, get their preferred frame geometry on the bikes, saddle, handlebar. You tell them to do a warm up. So, you know, they do their warm up, they keep it the same. Don't restrict participants on sort of like, you know, just to keep the ecological ability high. So like doing your own sort of warm up. And then after that, after they're finished their warm up, we take another blood sample. And basically that just kind of gives us an idea, okay, well, how much bicarb is potentially lost or gained following the warm up. I think what you'll see in like the 4K study that came out with recently with Lewis and Andy is that you know it actually rose quite a bit, like just a little bit after pre-exercise and following their warm up. So I think it's just to determine, you know, whether I think it's important to be able to see, okay, like what's the effect of the warm up having on sort of like, you know, on a, you know, 5 to 10 minute warm up after ingesting bicarb, ready to start the time.
Yeah.
So I think that's quite important as well, as to see, you know, what's, you know, happening at every sort of stage really.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Interesting. I certainly could see this being something more where like this, like sweat testing, you know, now people can buy patches or they can get it done in a lab. And yeah, it might be something where people are coming and getting their finger pricked every 10 minutes for 3 hours.
I think one of the issues with that I don't see it so much as being one of those like testing lactate or testing sweat. We don't actually know what amount of a rise, they don't correlate. So if you only rose by 4 millimeters or 4 millimoles, it doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to have a great performance. Like you could have a small rise and then have a really good performance. Or you could have like a big rise. You could rise by 7 millimoles from baseline, but you're a non-responder. So there isn't that correlation necessarily between how much you rise in your performance. We're saying generally, if you have a 5 millimole increase, it's very likely. And if you have a 6 millimole increase, it's very, very likely. But you could still have a performance, like you still have that rise. It's not going to actually for sure give you that performance. So that's where it's also, is it really beneficial to know when your peak is? Or you could come to the lab and get a baseline. You could take the test or a supplement, come back 2.5 hours later and see where you rose to. But that's not really going to tell you exactly if it's going to work for you or not.
it might be just to add to that, maybe it's more beneficial, saying like, obviously we mentioned, 60 quid for the Maurten supplement, 15 pounds a dose. Okay. However, like, maybe, where solution is sort of like, okay, we know that it's reproducible in time to peak blood bicarbonate. So basically, if you take it once and you take it again, some of the work from Lewis, when he was a PhD student here, basically showed that, time to peak was reproducible in male collegiate athletes. So maybe something like that, where, it's quick to metabolize, right? So the bicarb solution in liquid form is sort of quicker to metabolize. Okay, where that fine margin, say if you're doing like a 4-kilometer time trial, something that's not as long, it may be, to go with your point, if you're asking like athletes to, potentially get their sort of like define their potential ergogenic response following bicarb solution, it might be more beneficial for that. But from some of the research that Matt and I and others have conducted with the Maurten products, that we probably wouldn't say that it's necessary at this point. But that doesn't say, to not do it for other forms of bicarb, because we know that it is reproducible in terms of getting your sort of like time to peak alkalosis response with solution. So maybe it's sort of like that, because, in terms of like the quicker sort of like exercise, the quicker like sprints, the 4Ks, your quicker sort of like durations, high intensity activities where it might be more vital to get that time to peak. It may be more necessary for athletes to go in and do it with those sort of forms, so like in liquid form. But, yeah.
And when you say reproducible and with in solution, so we're talking about like taking it multiple times in a day in a liquid form?
So I was like, say like a study showed that, basically, in order to find out if the ergogenic response is reproducible, participants would come in twice over, say, a few day period or whatever, take solution in bicarb, maintain same habitual sort of like food diary to ensure that everything is controlled, or at least time that at least is trying to be controlled.
Right.
Obviously that's hard with participants coming into lab, different lives, different schedules.
Yes.
But basically, seeing if you can get that. So say if my time to peak on day one is 60 minutes and it's, 90 minutes the next time I come in, that shows that it isn't probably as reproducible, where if I get a 60-minute response on day one, where that's my peak, I get a 5 millimole per liter increase. And then on day two, I come in and I get the same. Well, we know that confidently say that, I can come in and I know that an hour is sufficient for me to get a 5 millimole per liter increase. And I can come in and take my bicarb at that time and do my 4-kilometer time trial, 60 minutes post ingestion, and confidently know that I'll get a decent alkalotic response.
Cool. Awesome. Okay. I know I totally went over time for you guys, so I hope that's okay. So I want to be mindful of that. So quickly here, where do you think this hydrogel / bicarb research needs to go or is going?
I would like to see it more in the ultra events and more in marathon. And kind of what I had mentioned before, because there's a couple different ways the bicarb could potentially be working, and this is all still theoretical. We don't exactly know why, but again, we could be having that extra lactate for fuel. We could be having lower pain scores. We could be getting the acidosis buildup, which is probably less likely in an ultramarathon runner. But I think it'd be quite interesting to see some of that more endurance stuff. And then I'd also like to see, I think, more in females as well, because even writing my first paper with the females, there's not a lot to draw on, and compare the Maurten to how it's working with enteric. If you do the same protocol, so like using the Maurten with an enteric or with a solution, having them all in the same study. Right now, we're just having Maurten by itself. We're just having enteric. I think there's some other like this enteric and there solution ones, like some of the traditional, there's a combination of different methods, but the Maurten right now is by itself. And so it'd be nice to compare Maurten with other products and see how it's working, see how the GI is, see how the response is with the exact same protocol.
Cool.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Amanda said. I have a decent interest in some of the extremes, so your hypoxia, your heat cold, sort of those like sort of different.
Mm.
So since we know it's sort of like, you know, keeping with like 40K since like about an hour's effort, the idea is that like, you know, do these performance, you know, improvements, sort of like the magnitude of performance, does it increase when we're like placed in these sort of environments?
Mm-hmm.
Because hydrogen ion accumulation is more rapid in say like the heat and say potentially hypoxia. So I think like those sort of things, and obviously look at standardized ingestion strategies just to make it as, you know, practical as well. I would say that probably, at least for myself and Amanda as well, that probably some of our sort of like beliefs are that, you know, it's, you know, what can we make most practical to athletes
Mm-hmm.
in the real world, so it's more applicable to their everyday sporting lives. You know, and that's probably one of the things with time to peak is like it's kind of like we're having a hard time with this strategy, with this product in particular, considering this is the only sort of form of bicarb that we've worked with, is that, you know, the idea is that we haven't really seen much of. Obviously, it's good to have the research on the time to peak with the Maurten bicarb. But in terms of like practicality wise, are we, you know, is this really like, you know, like, is this really beneficial to athletes where we can just kind of like standardize it maybe? So
Mm-hmm.
research that kind of like comes out with that, maybe, you know, potential standardized versus time to peak sort of like study. But yeah, those sort of things. I think we're all on like the same sort of track.
Yeah. The hypoxia. So we're talking like altitude when you say that, right?
Yeah, so a little bit of altitude, yeah.
Yeah. That would be really interesting. I just had some athletes do I'm not sure if you're familiar with Leadville, where in Colorado, where they're like getting above 12,000 feet
Yeah.
elevate.
So
Oh, that's you probably
what
used
does
to
that
meters,
word for
but
it? Is that like a mile? Is that like a mile?
12,000 feet?
Yeah,
12,000
sorry.
feet is like 2 miles high.
It's
Let
a
me do my
mile.
quick
All right.
conversion for your what you want meters?
Yeah, I'm more familiar in meters.
Okay, that is 3,657 meters.
Right. So
They're going above that.
yeah, right.
Yeah, it's high. I think they say it's like higher than any of the climbs in the Tour or something like that. Tour de France.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
not sure if that helps put anything in perspective, but
So how
um,
realistic is it to simulate those sort of like elevations, like where else in the
right.
world, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
most like Denver, right? Is that a mile? That's what I was.
That's a mile. Yeah, Denver's like
That's
six.
what a mile. That's how I got Colorado.
Yes. Yeah.
The mile high. You have, you know,
Yes.
in France, a mile. In
Mm-hmm.
China.
Zona has some altitude. I went there for a
Yes.
training at
Yeah.
Tucson, went
Mm-hmm.
up to MP.
Yeah. 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 They have some
Yeah.
good climbing. That's a lot of place where a lot of athletes go in winter because, well, some, you know, it's a little bit warmer for the most part. But yeah, that's that would be really fascinating. I'd love to see some research in that area as well, the altitude exposure with that and the effects. So very interesting. Okay. Two truths and a lie. I got to jump back to that. Okay. Eli said he was fluent in French, went to a boarding school, and has been in the UK for over 5 years. I said you were not fluent in French. Is that the lie?
Yeah, you're correct.
Oh, yay. Awesome. Okay. Perfect. Oh, that's great. Okay. And then Amanda, you said you lived in Spain for a year and never learned Spanish. You have no musical talent and you don't like coffee. I said that don't like coffee is a lie. Is that right?
No, I've actually played piano for 10 years and I
Oh,
used to compete in music festivals, so
oh,
I do have
wow.
musical talent, but I do not
Amazing.
like
Darn. Okay, well, I'm bummed you don't like coffee. But that's really cool. The music and the science brain, that's a good combo to have. I've heard I actually have no musical talent. So I suffer in that area. But I've heard that like creates there's a lot of like Silicon Valley people that are like end up, I don't know, they've done some stuff where they've looked and they like the people who have come up doing music and then it does something to the brain, from my understanding. I'm not versed in that side of the literature,
I've
but
heard that as well. It's supposed to be good something with your brain. I'm not really sure,
yeah.
but it's work okay. I don't
Yeah, seems like you're doing good with it. It worked out well. Awesome. So let's see, where can our listeners find you, follow you guys, stay up to date with your publications, all that stuff?
Well, I post quite regularly on Instagram with
Okay.
Running with Regnier, so you can find me there. I'll be posting lots of my new research that's coming out, previous research. It's mainly with endurance running right now, a little bit cycling. Like I do really love cycling, so you'll see some cool cycling locations on there. But I love like the research side, nutrition research, but all for endurance runners, mainly half marathon, marathon, ultra marathon. So all on
Cool.
Instagram.
Awesome. We will
Um,
tag that in the show notes. And what about you, Eli?
I'm pretty active on Twitter, Eli Shannon 5, or Instagram, Eli Shannon 2000, or LinkedIn, Eli Shannon. So either of those options, or by
All
email
right.
as well. So yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, we will link those in the show notes for our listeners. And thank you again so much for joining us, you guys. This has been so fun.
Thank you for
Thanks
having
for
us.
having us.